new people. I don't know you guys. AEI? No. No, I'm joking. With all due respect to my friends at AEI. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Steve Clemons. I run the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation, and we've been having a lot of great programs. I am happy to see Josh Gottbaum get this man a chair. In fact, he can have my chair. I also want to say hello. I don't know, I feel like it's a hot, humid day. You ought to just be happy. I think we're going to have a fascinating discussion. We've got a very good group here today. We're online. We've got a couple hundred folks watching us online, I just saw right now, so I want to say hello to the folks at the Washington Note, a blog I'm affiliated with. In fact, there's an affiliated blogger here. You're going to blog today for the event, right? That's what you're working on. Yeah, okay, good. We recently had an event with Grover Norquist, who is also a friend. Grover, as many of you know, is sort of the central nerve, part of the central nerve operation of the Republican political machine in the country. I know other Republicans who would dispute that, but it was a fascinating discussion in terms of what Grover saw as the new and next direction of the Republican Party and what he implied were the constraints on the Democratic Party. Thus, I'm fascinated and pleased to say that today we have a very good friend, Sidney Blumenthal, who has a new book out called The Strange Death of Republican America, intriguing title, Chronicles of a Collapsing Party. I think this is going to be an opportunity to hear, not necessarily a response to Grover, but an alternative view. Many of you people, everyone knows Sid Blumenthal. I just described him a few minutes ago on my blog as the most insiderish of insiders in Washington. And I think that he is very much part of the nerve center of the Democratic Party here. And again, I know Democrats who would dispute that. But it's one of those things that Sid Blumenthal has been part of the rise and the empowerment of the Clinton franchise in American politics, and I think that's not disputed. He has a 20-year career as a journalist at the New Republic, the Washington Post, the Vanity Fair, and the New Yorker. He was, of course, senior advisor to President Bill Clinton from August 1997 until January of 2001, senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and he's been author in the post-Clinton years of the Clinton Wars, and his previous books include The Permanent Campaign, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, Pledging Allegiance, The Last Campaign of the Cold War. And he is, frankly, and I'm quite proud to say, a very good friend of mine, very good friend of the New America Foundation, always an open door, and gives me a lot of important counsel on our own activities and programs. And to his right, we have my friend Michael Lind. Mike is author of one of the founding manifesto of this organization was a book called The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics, which he co-wrote with Ted Halstead. Mike was one of the co-founders of the New America Foundation. He's Whitehead Senior Fellow here at our institution. He's author of a lot of fun books, including a poem about the Alamo, which I think became the state poem of Texas until the Bushes came in. But he was author of Made in Texas, George W. Bush and the Southern Takeover of American Politics, as well as What Lincoln Believed. But most recently, I think importantly to my program, the American Strategy Program, Mike wrote a groundbreaking study of American grand strategy called The American Way of Strategy, U.S. Foreign Policy and the American Way of Life. That book will be issued in paperback in September. And we'll be back. Is that Mark Chavon in the audience? Mark, it's great to see you. So we have another surprise. We have a lot of surprising friends. This is going to be a great discussion. Mark Chavon used to be the bureau chief for the NRC Handelsblatt, definitely Europe's smartest man. So we will have a very good discussion here. So without further ado, let me invite Sid to share his thoughts on what's happened with the Republican movement in the country, and then I'm going to ask Mike to offer some comments. Then we're going to have a very nice sort of afternoon salon discussion. Sid Blumenthal. Why don't you stand up here, Sid? It's better for the camera.
Will do. Thank you very much, Steve. Delighted to be here at the New America Foundation. Always happy to be here, and glad to be here with my friends, Steve and Mike, and to see old friends in the crowd as well. I'm going to speak briefly, and then look forward to your questions about maybe even the Democrats. But first I'll speak about the Republicans, which is the subject of my new book, The Strange Death of Republican America. This book might be called a chronicle of modern twilight. It is it captures the end days of not only the Bush administration, but what I believe to be the long Republican ascendancy that began with Richard Nixon, and perhaps even before in 1966 with the initial congressional midterms that were the harbinger of this era of Republican dominance, now coming to an end. This is a tale of, in a way, the end of empire and the end of dynasty. One of the, I noticed that this week President Bush appeared before a group of people out in the country and asked for questions, and no one had a question for the president. And he said, you know, I have a lot of interesting stories. But even though there seems to be a lack of interest in the still incumbent president, he remains, and his administration and what he has done, the most significant factor in the 2008 presidential election. This is the ground fact, overwhelming all else in the election. And to a great degree, this election is a referendum on what he's done, and it overwhelms and overshadows the other factors. It is because of his radicalism that Barack Obama is the Democratic nominee, in great part. And it is also because of him that the Republican Party has fractured, enabling John McCain to become the Republican nominee. I remember some time ago, maybe about a year ago, a news item appearing in the Post, Washington Post, announcing the oddest office of this administration. It was called the Office of Lessons Learned. I have seen no publication from this office. It may be the bleak house of the Bush administration, but let us consider some of the lessons ourselves. To begin with, and we can argue, I believe that the party is over. The Republican Party is doomed to be a minority party for some time to come. It has reached its apogee, its zenith, under Bush, and regardless of whether or not John McCain somehow becomes president, is elected in 2008, we know that the Democrats are almost certain to increase their majorities in the House and the Senate, and that we are in for Democratic Congresses for a number of cycles to come, at least. In this Bush epic, there are notable characters, all of who have played their roles and acted out the decline of what I would call this regime. I call it a regime more than an administration, because it is the end of this long period in which the Republicans essentially, even though they were not always in control of the Congress, nonetheless were the dominant force in our politics. Bush, the decider, a man of radical sensibility, Manichaean in the way in which he saw the world, black and white, both highly decisive as he sought to depict himself, and passive and played upon. Dick Cheney, who played upon the president adroitly, whose nickname, according to the Secret Service when he was Chief of Staff to President Ford, was backseat, as in backseat driver, giving the directions, even back then. And it was Cheney who understood the nuances and details of the federal bureaucracy and of the ambitions, motives, and interests of all the players, and how to regulate and manipulate them according to his own idea of what the presidency should be. An imperial presidency, the apotheosis of Richard Nixon's idea of the presidency that had been thwarted in Watergate. Donald Rumsfeld, Cheney's initial mentor and partner, generally thought of as a great white shark within the federal government, who taught Cheney the importance of bureaucratic maneuvering and warfare and ruthlessness. Karl Rove, known as the architect, or as Bush called him, Turd Blossom, a man who could make flowers bloom in the most unlikely places. Rove, who dreamed of a one-party state, the control of the federal government for political purposes, in order to forge a lasting realignment, using the tragedy of 9/11 as the catalyst for his political project. And in the Congress, let us not forget Tom DeLay, the hammer, who kept a whip hung on his wall when he was the House whip. The man who created the K Street Project, a new iron triangle that would never be broken of interests and politics, who ran the Congress and directed the action, even since the impeachment of President Clinton, driven very much by Tom DeLay and his iron-fisted control of the Congress. All of this reached its height under Bush. At each phase of the Republican period, I think we can now look back and see that none of it was inevitable. All of the history that happened was contingent on events, and yet at every turn, each major development was more radical than the next. From Nixon, who is now seen from various angles in history as even to the left of many Democrats now, with his wage and price controls, with his economic programs, the Congress adopted Pat Moynihan's program for a basic platform for earned income. The Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency. So we see Nixon in a different light. And Reagan appears far more radical than Nixon. And after Reagan, Newt Gingrich, even more radical than that. And then Bush, at each turn more radical. Bush, of course, had promised that he would be a version, more modern, more politically adroit, of his father, and resolve the political tension that his father represented, of being a Connecticut Yankee transplanted to Texas and not quite able to bridge the geopolitical gap within the Republican Party. Bush was supposed to be the resolution of that, partly through his compassionate conservatism. But Bush instead pushed his project to the most radical stage yet of the Republican Party. And even though he had enormous political advantages, particularly after 9/11, he still was operating to a great degree on thin ice. After all, he had lost the majority of the popular vote in 2000. In 2004, while he certainly won and won by more than 50%, it was not by a great majority. And yet in each case, he took these votes as being enormous mandates, and not simply as mandates for an ordinary administration, but for a radical administration. This was hailed by many observers as the culmination of republicanism. As I note in my book, I quote from the American editors of The Economist magazine, who published a book after the 2004 election called The Right Nation, in which they said that who would have imagined that the 2004 presidential election would represent something of a last chance for the Democrats? The right clearly has ideological momentum on its side in much the same way that the left had momentum in the 1960s. Well, this was very short-lived. What Bush tried to do was to unify Cheney's idea of the imperial presidency and Rove's idea of a political realignment in fundamentally altering the Constitution. He sought an unfettered executive, using the war power of the president in his capacity as commander-in-chief to do whatever he wished. And we saw that transformation. We often hear these terms about transactional and transformative presidents, transformational president. Well, Bush was transformational. I happen to think that these are bogus concepts, but Bush was transformational. He transformed our government. And just as he transformed the intelligence community in the run-up to the Iraq War and afterwards, and transformed the State Department, sidelining it, and transformed the Department of Defense, and transformed the Department of Justice, as we've seen, and turned it into a and transformed the Federal Emergency Management Agency. All of that had a consistency to it in its view of government. It was highly political, highly ideological, and it was reduced to the will of the executive. There was a dreamlike atmosphere to all of this, perhaps best shown not only with FEMA in New Orleans, but the Coalitional Provisional Authority in Iraq, which was an almost pure expression of radical ideas, unbound by regulation, oversight. And we saw Iraq, in a way, used as a laboratory. In the early part of the 20th century, progressives talked about using the states as laboratories for policy. And under Bush, Iraq became the laboratory for the policies that could not be implemented even with a Republican Congress and a Republican presidency. Bush, let me just read a little bit about what he tried to do with this presidency. I just want to read a couple paragraphs here. This was a very extensive project. I think the ultimate expression of it was the policy on torture. I've not only written this book, some of you may have seen a documentary that I produced, directed by Alex Gibney, called Taxi to the Dark Side. Steve hosted a showing of it. It'll be shown on HBO in September. It won the Academy Award this year. And I believe that torture really represented the unaccountable, unfettered executive in its purest form, and that the story of that, which Jane Mayer has now described in her book, The Dark Side, is at the heart of this constitutional transformation. I wrote in this book, the imperial president must, by definition, be an infallible leader. Only he can determine what is a mistake because he is infallible. Stephen Bradbury, the acting director of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, who wrote secret memos justifying the torture policy in 2005, defined this Bush doctrine in congressional testimony in 2006. The president is always right. Placing his statement in context, Bradbury explained that he was referring to the war paradigm, the neoconservative idea of the Bush presidency, the law of war, wherein the president is a law unto himself. This notion seems medieval, but it is central to the new radical notion of the presidency. When Bradbury uttered his extraordinary remark, he did not think he was saying anything unusual. His statement, after all, was only a corollary of Nixon's infamous one made in his post-resignation interview with David Frost. When the president does it, that means it's not illegal. Bush exceeds Nixon in his claim of divine inspiration from the higher father. Early on, at the beginning of Bush's various wars, he was interviewed by Bob Woodward, whose changing portrait of Bush and the other dramatic personages is a way of chronicling the change not only in the administration but in how journalism during this period came to see these figures. Asked Bush how he would be seen in history, and Bush said, "History will all be dead." Well, now Bush seems to be consumed with his reputation and legacy in history, and sees himself in some ways as, in the light of various past leaders who were wartime leaders, were unpopular, and who stayed the course. He sees himself somewhat like Truman. He sees himself as Lincoln, as Churchill. But I am reminded of a statement that was made by Karl Rove, and it was a statement in which he was quoted as an anonymous source in the New York Times Magazine right before the 2004 election. And he said, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do." Well, I believe that now we will be left not only to study what is left of the Bush presidency, and not simply study. I'm sure some of you have seen the trailer for Oliver Stone's new film, W. Even film it and depict it in legendary or realistic ways. We'll find out. But we are going to have to deal with the consequences. They have already shaped the contours of the 2008 election, and whoever is elected president in 2008 will face a task of reform, and both McCain and Obama speak of themselves as reformers, that is greater than a question of mere ethics or campaign finance law, but of actually reconstructing our own government in every department and agency. And that will be a Herculean task. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm sure that some of them will even deal with the Democratic Party.
Thank you, Sidney.
Thank you.
And now to offer some comments, Michael Lind. And then Joe Sorrentioni gets the first question.
Well, it's always a pleasure to read and listen to Sidney Blumenthal. He's a fairly rare figure in Washington in as much as he's a scholar and a historian, as well as a political insider and journalist, and in a city where most people think in terms of 6 weeks or 6 months. He thinks in terms of decades and generations. And that will be my excuse for developing one theme that he mentioned, but I'd like to hear more about from him, this idea that we're at the end of a regime or an era that began with Richard Nixon and evolved through Reagan and finally culminated with George W. Bush, now giving way to evidently something quite different and historic. In the early years of this century, around 2000, 2001, I was studying theories of cycles in American history, like Arthur Schlesinger's and various others, and none of them seemed very impressive to me, but there was one interesting pattern of 72-year cycles broken into 36-year cycles. And if you look at it, just very briefly, 1788 to 1824, that was a critical election, beginning of the Jacksonian era. 1824 to 1860, Lincoln, the Civil War. 1860 to 1896, it's generally agreed 1896 was a crucial turning point. 1896 to 1932. 1932 to 1968, and then 1968 to 2004. Well, 68 is generally recognized as the hinge between the New Deal era and the conservative era, if you want to call that the era of the conservative ascendancy. So then I did the math. Okay, let's see, 1968 plus 36 is 2004. And so then when 2004 came and Bush was reelected, I thought, well, so much for that theory. And then almost immediately after his reelection, this whole regime began just falling apart very rapidly with the 2006 Democratic majority. And not only that, with defeat after defeat on every front of the basic policy initiatives of the conservative era, from this idea of U.S. unilateralism in the world, repudiating the older New Deal liberal internationalism. The centerpiece of conservative and libertarian policy for a generation had been the privatization, or at least partial privatization of Social Security. That was the crown jewel of the New Deal era. If you could knock that out, then you could privatize everything else, from unemployment insurance, across the board. So health care, you could have health savings accounts. So there had been this well thought out, very, very intelligent, very well funded campaign to overturn the New Deal. And the public just rejected this, even though it was a centerpiece of Bush's second-term domestic agenda. Every day, every month, every year now, we're shifting very rapidly from this era when the free market ruled and government was simply bad, to the re-regulation of the economy, often driven by crises, like the subprime mortgage crisis. My guess is that my initial little back-of-the-envelope calculation turned out to be right in terms of policy, not necessarily politics. And as Sid mentioned, during this era of conservative ascendancy, you had Democratic Congresses. You had Democratic presidents, 2 of them. But nevertheless, the agenda tended to be set by the post-1968 right, which, by the way, was different from the 1932 to 1968 right. It's just a different set of issues, different set of actors. That's just, I want to raise the issue, in the question period, not make any particular predictions, but there is a sense that in the last couple of years, we're in the middle of a transition that's as historic in policy. It's not necessarily in partisan politics. For example, in these other eras, you had the same voting patterns because the electoral issues were the same, prohibition or the tariff or something like that. So when you have one of these great shifts, it's not necessarily the case that you'll have one party will govern forever and the other won't, or that the red states will all become blue states, or anything like that. But it's just that the basic issues have changed, the basic mentality. I just want to wrap up by saying that if this is the case, and it's sort of a question for Sid, everything he said about Bush, I think, is correct. And the peculiar nature even of some of these post-Nixon conservatives and their vision of the presidency and of national power and so on. But in a way, can't you cut him some slack? In as much as if the regime was going to fall apart in the first decade of the 21st century anyway, it would have fallen apart under President McCain had he been elected in 2000. How much credit do you give to the regime decaying and how much to a particular politician inadvertently destroying it?
Thank you, Mike. Now we've got an opening. I'm going to chime in here and there, but I want to give Joe Cirincione the first question, president of the Plowshares Fund, the distinguished white-haired guy in the middle.
Thank you very much. One of many.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Terrific presentations, and Sid Blumenthal, I too was struck by that New York Magazine article. It's the David Susskind piece that seemed to capture what they were doing, and it was true. They were creating their own reality. Afghanistan, Iraq, torture camps, coalitions of the willing. They were creating things that we hadn't seen before, and they seemed to work. And then the whole thing crashes. And my question to both of you, and you brought this up at the end, Michael, what particular reef does this conservative ship hit that breaks it? Is it the economic policies? Is it the war in Iraq? Is it the corruption of the party apparatus? What accounts for
With
this?
the John Bolton nomination?
Was it the John? Did they just go too far? Was this? I'm struck by your description of an increasingly radical conservative regime. Did they just leave the American people behind? Did they just walk out and the limb just breaks? How do you sum it up?
Thank you. Sid?
Thanks. Let me try and answer Mike's and Joe's question I don't know if I have a definitive answer, but they're both excellent questions. And I think that historians now will be debating this forever. How inevitable was this, that it would turn out...
So Karl Rove was right.
Yeah. I can recall some of our most prominent journalists talking about Karl Rove being the great genius of our time, up to even days before the 2006 midterm elections. I think that this could have been played differently, but this is all Monday morning quarterbacking and history and politics now. Bush was, on September 10th, 2001, at the lowest point of any president in that early part of his presidency in polling ever taken. He was headed below 50%. He looked very much to anyone who was familiar with presidents who had lost popular majorities, and there were a number of in our history, like a one-term president, as they all had been. And then 9/11 happened.
Which would have fit Michael's cycle.
Right. And then September 11th happens. The country is obviously traumatized. And Bush could have done any number of things with this crisis. He could have suddenly declared a government of national unity and brought Democrats into the cabinet. He could have, like Roosevelt did in World War II, bringing in Henry Stimson as Secretary of War and so on. He could have done any number of things. What he did was to use this for the most partisan purposes and to drive Rove's idea of realignment and Cheney's idea of the presidency. I believe in 2004, there were many, many factors, but the trauma of 9/11 still remained as the essential driver of the outcome of that election. Underneath this, as I pointed out briefly, Bush had lost the popular majority. And if I can put in a word for what we did in the 90s, I think we had laid the groundwork for a different kind of democratic era. Al Gore, had he been elected and been allowed to have assume office, would have moved forward from what was done in that period. How soon we forget, we were running surpluses that were going to be used for social investment. The prestige of the country was never higher. The kind of international coalition that was built in Kosovo would have been a model for what was done, I think, in Afghanistan and later. If you recall, Afghanistan was not a NATO operation and ought to have been.
But let me
let me just get to what Joe says very briefly. I don't want to filibuster. What broke the Republican Party? It was almost everything. It was in foreign policy, the doctrine of preemptive warfare. It was the way in which they were hell-bent on reaching all of their conclusions and strip mining all of the departments and agencies, cherry-picking intelligence, sidelining the State Department, blackballing, blacklisting anyone who had any experience with nation building. What went on inside the Defense Department with Rumsfeld and Doug Feith and Wolfowitz. That was only one area. Then in social policy, FEMA was not a one-off. It was not unusual, as we've seen in how departments and agencies were politicized and turned into patronage dumps. And it wasn't simply to give people jobs. There's a lot of money in contracts here, not just hundreds of millions, but billions, as we begin to see. Look what's happened in the Department of Justice. The whole the stories of the last week involving Monica Goodling and the total politicization of the Department of Justice really reflects the Rove project and the harnessing of government to create a political realignment and use government and policy only for those ends. All of that came apart, and corruption and hypocrisy played a big role, including with the Congress, whereas Tom DeLay today. What happened with Ted Stevens, while it might be a singular story about him and about Alaska, but in this context, Ted Stevens, represents, even though the Democrats now control the Congress, he represents what happened when they had complete control. And the bridge to nowhere is now the metaphor for where the Republicans are, at least in terms of their congressional prospects this year. I think we could go on and on.
Let me just quickly myself follow up with Joe, and then I'll come to Josh Gottbaum. Not that the John Bolton battle was not a large battle in all the scheme of things, but it was a microcosm of some things that I think were important. You refer to Bolton in your book as an intelligence agent for Dick Cheney at the State Department, spying on Colin Powell. It's not a description with which I wouldn't argue. But why the Bolton battle, which started in early 2005, mattered is it showed some trends that I would like you to comment on. One is that was really a Republican civil war. You could not have beaten John Bolton without a deep divide, whether or not the players in that battle on the Republican side were overt. Almost everything in my role that was useful came from Republican sources to try to undo disappointment. At the same time, when you listen to Joe Biden, all of Dick Durbin, all of whom retracted what they said, the Sunday morning talk shows were populated by Democrats who kept conceding defeat before the battle over Bolton had been fought. And what you saw as a part of the DNA of Republican posture at the time was declaring victory before the battle had been won. And I wrote that at the time, saying this seemed endemic both in the Democratic Party apparatus and the Republican. The make your own weather, we make history, we define reality attitude among leading Republicans, and the concession of that reality by Democrats was so obvious during the first several months of the Bolton battle. And so there was complicity, at least in deference, from the Democrats to this. And I'm wondering if you can comment at all about that, about the structural dimension of the complicity of Democratic empowerment of that imperial executive.
On the Bolton case, let me say that on one level, it was a conflict over the character of U.S. internationalism versus unilateralism. But on another level, it was about professionalism in government. I think, as Steve has pointed out, many Republicans were very concerned not only with the former, but also the latter, and what had happened, what was really happening to very serious professional standards within government. And that came to a head with John Bolton. In part, many Democrats during this period, and perhaps even now, have failed to recognize the true agenda of the radicals on the right, in a way that some Republicans recognize more readily, of having to live in the same house with them. I can remember years ago when I was a reporter at the Washington Post talking to a moderate Republican congressman, and he said, "You don't know what it's like. It's like living with rabid Dobermans running around your house." You're on the outside. You don't know what it's like on the inside. So I think that there's something to that. But on the part of the Democrats, the Democrats have a kind of, a benign ignorance about the right, in which they assume that the Republican Party somehow is some kind of mirror image of their party. And these two parties, they're like, the Yankees and the Red Sox. And it's not like that at all, actually. It's not like that in the Democratic Party. It's not like in the Republican Party. It's very specific. And the motives of the right are little appreciated by, I think, many people on the Democratic side. There's a kind of complacency that created an atmosphere of ready defeatism.
Josh Cotbaum.
Sid, I want to push this question of what causes the end of an era and what has led to the end of the Republican empire a little bit, and in a couple of ways. One, do you think that George Herbert Walker Bush 41 was more radical than Reagan? And the reason I'm asking this is I'm trying to get a sense, and to ask the question, and now I'll be explicit about it, was the end of this era caused by the realization of, let's call them normal people, that the Republicans had become too radical? Or, alternative possibility, was it, and we're reminded of this by Ted Stevens, was the end of that era occasioned by the fact of what was seen as widespread corruption and failure of moral purpose on the part of that administration? In other words, was it the Social Security reform that really said enough is enough? Or was it something like Katrina and Abramoff, et cetera? And the reason I ask that is, since you've been begging us to ask what the Democrats should do, I will. Should Democrats infer from that, if we, I'm very explicitly a Democrat, if we win in November, that is a mandate for a liberal, now progressive agenda? Or should we interpret that as a mandate simply to correct ethical excesses, corruption in government, absolutism, etc.?
I take these to be three questions, and I'll try and be as brief as possible. Obviously, George Herbert Walker Bush was not an extension or acceleration of Reagan's radicalism, but an attempt to correct its excesses as he understood them, to create a kinder, gentler nation. And that was really a comment that on Reagan. And I remember at the '88 convention, Nancy Reagan was displeased at the candidate's remark about a kinder, gentler nation. Who was he talking about, she said. On the question of radicalization in the Bush administration, I think that to some degree the disintegration of public support has come through opposition to radicalization, and a lot of it has come as a result of the consequences of it, much more as from the consequences. Let me be clear about this briefly. One, in the second term, which now seems like ancient history to us, we remember that Bush set out to begin a wedge to privatize Social Security. He never got to a single committee hearing in the Republican Congress. It was so unpopular. At the same time, remember, one of the decisive moments was the Terry Schiavo case. The Democrats, Steve had raised the question of how they had behaved in this period, thought that the public would overwhelmingly support the Bush Republican position on Schiavo. Remember, Bush had come back even from the Texas White House to sign a bill at the White House. It was so crucial. And the Democrats all voted for this and then ran away and left town. And then I remember a poll came out and something like 70-some% of the public disapproved. That was a shock to both parties of where the public was on this matter. But more important were widespread failures. The perception that the Iraq War did not work as Bush had advertised, needless to say. And then, devastatingly, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So that the failure was seen from Gulf to shining Gulf, from not only overseas, but here at home. On the question of the Democrats in a mandate, it would be a mistake to get ahead of oneself. And hubris is a major factor in the downfall here of this administration, and it's easy to begin dreaming of Democratic mandates. But if there were to be one, there would be many potential political pitfalls that Democrats should be aware of. Not only in having to deal with correcting the excesses, because these are not simply things of avoiding certain kinds of behavior or just legislating against them. The government is going to have to be reorganized, reconstructed from top to bottom in many major departments. And it's going to take some time, and it's going to require a great deal of, to use a discredited word, experience and knowledge of how government actually operates. And there will be a problem, as there was for the Republicans, that the Democrats should be aware of, which is that when you control the Congress and the presidency, you own complete responsibility, and the public holds you responsible. And it is, under those circumstances, the greatest guards against arrogance need to be put into place mentally on the part of those who hold that responsibility.
Terrific. Mark Chauvin, over here.
I have a tiny question about the upcoming presidential elections. Michael, a couple of years ago you informed me about the built-in distortions in the American electoral system. In view of the democratic era predicted by Sidney, are you confident this is all going to materialize? Or will the system be able to play tricks on Obama?
Well, I'm not prepared to give you a county-by-county, state-by-state breakdown. Obviously, the Electoral College disadvantages the populous states, and like the U.S. Senate, it gives additional weight to fairly underpopulated states, particularly in the Mountain West. That's why I distinguished in my remarks between a new partisan pattern and a new policy era. It's quite possible. I think McCain could win. Everyone is assuming now that he can't, but I think it is possible that he might. It's also possible that for some time to come, we will see this red state, blue state pattern, that will persist. But I think there's another plane on which, and that's the policy plane. And sometimes that changes even if the electoral map does not change. And I just have this intuition, and I may be mistaken, that this period of deregulation, but also of this very neoconservative foreign policy, is over. And to answer Joe's question earlier, my answer to what reef the Republican Party broke on is in two words: Reagan Democrats. That is, I think the success of the Republican Party in this era, the last 30, 40 years, was based on the George Wallace Democrats, who then voted for the Republicans, largely because of hawkish foreign policy and conservative social values. They never bought into the agenda of the neoconservatives in foreign policy. That was an ideological sect, a very tiny one. They never bought into the whole Milton Friedman, privatize the New Deal libertarian agenda. That's another sect. Which is not to say that Democrats can't fall into the same trap. One of the problems in our system, and it's true in most political systems, is the mass electorate has values and sentiments, but it doesn't have ideologies. It doesn't have highly consistent views. So you have these factions and sects and ideologies in all parties. And if they get too far ahead of their voters, then they will have fallen into the trap we were discussing. They will have mistaken a vote for the party for a mandate for that particular complex program, which may not be either shared or understood by most of the voters.
Did you want to comment, Sid?
I'll wait for another
Okay,
question. then
Gary
I'll
Mitchell.
comment.
Thanks. Sidney, a couple of weeks ago, Jane Mayer was here, and she and Steve did a particularly interesting session, and she said something that struck me as illustrative of an idea that I want to ask you about. It was a lot of discussion about Cheney and Addington and all of that, dismantling the Constitution. And someone said, well, where was Bush in all of this? And she said, Bush keeps sliding out of the frame. And so my question to you is, in the time that you've been sort of taking a look underneath the hood of this administration, do you think that as we get further away from it and more papers become public, that we will describe this as the Bush administration, or will this be the Cheney, Rumsfeld, the boys of Richard Nixon? It all began with Richard Nixon, and in a way it all ended with Richard Nixon, because the real operators of the levers in the crucial part of this administration might have been Cheney and Rumsfeld less Bush? That's a question, not a statement about whether that's
Interesting
the
question,
case.
Gary. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question. And I understand why Jane said that Bush keeps sliding out of the frame, because there's so few sources on what Bush actually says, does, initiates. I think he initiates very little. But I hear mixed things. This is just my own experience, because this is a question that has perplexed me too. And for example, the people I used to work with in the British government, when I was in the White House, I asked them about Bush, because they would sit in the room. And they said Bush was much more present than people gave him credit for. Then I would talk to some people in the State Department, people who had been ambassadors, people who were high officials, and they told me that they would run into Bush and they would brief him, and he was highly guarded, he was incurious, and he was given certain materials by people who controlled the flow of information. If they could break through to him, he was surprised and somewhat open to what they might say, depending on what the subject was. So I think it's a mixture of both, and we're going to have to learn what the events were that happened as they happened, and how he behaved. I mean, what kind of information did he get? My sense is he decides, but that everything's shaped for him. He has not requested a lot of information, has not been the active player in that sense.
Can I just add
Yeah,
something to that?
go ahead.
Dan Rather, in one of his books, recounts a conversation he had with Lyndon Johnson at the ranch in Texas, right before Johnson died. And Johnson had just come back from the White House, Nixon White House. And according to Rather, he said, "Dan, I worry for the future of our country. You know, when I was president, I had 6 TVs going, I had 8 phones. I would call up these Peckerwoods in the bureaucracy, find out what's really going on, because I knew the cabinet secretaries were lying to me." And he said, "Dan, I was just up there in Mr. Nixon's office, and there was only one phone on the desk. And that phone only had 3 buttons. And you know what, Dan? They all went to Germans." Nixon, Kissinger, and Haldeman.
Let me go to Jim Pinkerton, who's the only one I know who used to actually work, like really literally work with George W. Bush.
Thanks, Steve.
Not in the administration,
No, in the
pre-administration.
1988 Bush campaign,
Yeah.
I was across the hall from him for a year. Sid, in amidst your pretty fierce criticism of the Bush-era Republican Party, there's also, it seems to me, a kind of an intense critique of the current Democratic Party and its nominee. You cited the accomplishments of Bill Clinton in the 90s. You lament the failure of Al Gore to become president. And, of course, you worked for Hillary Clinton earlier this year. And the Clinton campaign, as we all know, was extremely blunt in its critique of Obama and its perception that he couldn't win the election. And I noticed in your presentation, you never mentioned John Kerry. If you mentioned the Democratic congressional leadership, I didn't hear it. And so I'm wondering, as we think about the horizon of 2008, you know, when I think back to the collapse of Eliot Spitzer's effort to give driver's licenses to illegals, when I think back to Senator Boxer's effort to get a global warming bill that couldn't even get 50 votes in a Democratic-controlled Senate, and I think about the Quinnipiac poll this morning that has people supporting the McCain position on offshore oil drilling by 30 points, I'm just wondering what advice you'd give Barack Obama to see if he could get above 46 in the polls.
I was waiting for that, Jim. Here's some advice I would give. I don't believe that there is a new map in 2008. I believe there's just the map. During the primaries Obama's campaign kept talking about the math, and now they talk about the need that somehow there's going to be a new map, and states that were previously closed to Democrats are somehow going to be open to them. I think that the classic elements are still in play. And while we have reached the end of a dominant Republican era, we have not yet reached the beginning of a Democratic one. And that will require not only winning in 2008, but governing successfully. The governing part is crucial to this whole part, and that will come later. But in terms of winning 2008, Obama must win the key swing states that are always the key swing states. And those states, those key constituencies, as among them, centrally is the one that Mike referred to, that in the past had been called Reagan Democrats, that in this campaign and the primaries, a great majority of which supported the candidate I worked for, Senator Clinton. And now, as the Democratic candidate, Barack Obama has to win them in order to win. And I think that is the basis of a strategy. It's as opposed to...
How would you grade their efforts so far in winning your former constituency?
I think that Obama needs to speak consistently and constantly to their concerns as their champion. If I had any advice, it would be to speak less about himself and more about them. That would be the key to winning their support, and for them to think that he is acting on their behalf and in their interest and understands their interests. So I think that this contest is going to come down to very familiar turf. It's going to come down to places like Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. I wish that there were more states in play, but I don't believe that there are. I think this is very doable for the Democrat, and this is, I think, the best opportunity in possibly 2 generations for the Democratic Party, and I'm hopeful.
Yes.
Alan Nichols, you mentioned the need for reconstruction in the wake of Bush to repair all the damage. And my question would be, is the reconstruction just a matter of putting good people in place in a system that already is sound, or actually dismantling the system with corrective legislation? And what kinds of moves, legislation, actions would you take as part of this reconstruction?
Well, I think it would differ department by department. I think, for example, in the Department of Justice, you don't need new legislation. I think you need to put in people who can do these jobs and fulfill the law. I think that some other areas are a mess. And I'm not sure that reorganizing them requires legislation so much as simply the executive dealing with them and reorganizing them. I think we've actually complicated and made more difficult some things through legislation over the last period, in my view, including intelligence.
We're doing a conference, I should say, in October. It fundamentally is going to be a 2-day deal. One day is going to pretty much focus on what's going on in sort of terror land. It's Al-Qaeda 3.0 with Peter Bergen and others. It's co-sponsored with the New York University Center on Law and Security, where Sid Blumenthal has been a senior fellow. But the other day is going to look at legal issues, a lot focusing on the detainee issues, but there'll be a component of it that focuses specifically on executive authority, executive order changes in the structure of various departments, particularly the Office of the Presidency, because one of the questions I frequently posed to John Podesta, who was, of course, close to Hillary Clinton. We had Tom Daschle here yesterday. I talked to him privately, who's close to Barack Obama, is what powers will they give up that this administration has taken? And not only taken in a general sense of just sort of puffing up, but actually Dick Cheney's office and David Addington, and this is what I find so insidious about Addington and why one should never underestimate him, is actually his work legally changing through executive order the both overt and implied powers of the presidency and the vice presidency. So I just wanted to put down that we'll be working with one of Sid's close friends. Jack Janes in the very back.
Sid, can I ask you a question about a legacy that's also been talked about as a danger for the Obama presidency, and that's the Carter presidency? Can you look back on that presidency and see any dangers that Carter ran into, any mistakes that Carter ran into, in an atmosphere which, of course, in this year and next year will have possibly double-digit problems economically for him, problems in Iran? There are a lot of familiar echoes of the Carter administration, and I wonder if you could say, is there anything we can learn, or that Obama should learn from that administration for his, should he have one?
Well, the Carter analogy is being raised a lot in this period. We should remember that when Jimmy Carter came in, I believe there were 55 Democratic senators, and a bigger majority of Democrats in the House than there is today, and yet it all went pretty badly, fairly quickly, overwhelmed by inherited crises. I think whoever is the next president is going to face a series of compounded crises in the economy and in foreign policy, domestically, in organization of government, just across the board. And I think this is going to be, I think there'll be a very short honeymoon. And if I had one word of caution for a new Democratic president, it would be that it's very important not to be misled by the Bush presidency and to somehow think that because that Bush was a strong president and that somehow a strong presidency is a bad idea. Even with a Democratic Congress, it's very important to have a really strong executive. Under Carter, if you recall, the Congress went to war against the president, and it was a Democratic Congress. And I remember what happened in the first 2 years of the Clinton presidency. Certainly the president made errors, but the Democratic Congress was heedless of the political consequences of and pursued narrow interests by factions in the Democratic Congress. So I don't think that we're in some kind of new utopian world.
Sid, there's a dinner each year in Washington called the White House Correspondents' Dinner, but there's also the Washington Correspondents' Dinner. And I think it was in 2006 I was invited to the Washington Correspondents' Dinner. It's much less dazzle, but they had Tom DeLay up there getting an honor and Dick Durbin. But Tom DeLay was hilarious. His favorite animal was a rat. He had pictures of himself and rats together and all this. But at that time in '06, he was reflecting on his colleagues in the Republican Party and saying he saw no conservatives. And he said, the only conservative I see in Congress is Hillary Clinton. And he then had this big banner called Hillary and the Hammer in '08. But when you think beyond the joke of it, there was something to her positioning at that time which seemed to many people to be slightly more, I don't know whether you're more to the center, more conservative, or a mix of things that people have raised very much, particularly on the issue of the war. I'm wondering if you had written this book before you did now, might she have not been among, would she not have been the target of someone like Tom DeLay in a joke, but of someone who was sort of seeing it politically expedient to position herself along some of the conservative currents at that time. And do you think that's a fair characterization by DeLay?
Well, in reverse order, what Tom DeLay had is fun. You know, we could have a long discussion about Senator Clinton's campaign and her career. And I don't know that you're asking about that.
Of course I am.
But what, and on that note, let me say that, and this is relevant to what's going on now, is that the character of the primary campaign changed in mid-February.
That's right.
And what had gone on earlier ended. The anti-war constituency was had overwhelmed the process up until then, and then suddenly all that became muted, and it was not simply the result of General Petraeus's various successes. It was the fact that the economy had emerged as the overwhelming issue, and that issue has grown and grown, and it will not recede, but become even larger as these remaining months in the campaign go on. And that is very important for the Democratic candidate to grasp, that it is not one issue in a basket of issues, but the number one issue and it's not an abstract question. It involves the lives of the voters, from mid-February on, Hillary pretty much swept the field, and had the economic issue taken root earlier, just a short time earlier, we might have had a different result.
Thank you. I'm going to close things now. I apologize to those people who had questions, because I have a lot of friends of Sidney here, and we've arranged for Politics and Prose to have the book out front, and we'd like to give Sidney some time to sign some of them to you. Please join me in thanking Michael Lind and Sidney Blumenthal for spending some time with us. We recommend the book. Thank you very, very much, Sid. Thank you. Great discussion.
Great.
So we're going to move